tell me about Houck Advertising. What was Houck Advertising?
Houck Advertising was a family business. My grandfather and a guy by the name of Jake Thomas put together a little boutique agency. It wasn't even called an agency back then. They were building what he referred to as a furniture digest in 1928. And what they would do, Granddad would go out and meet with some of the people that were running furniture manufacturers, and they put together a book that was a specialty book that dealt with all the furniture manufacturers in that part of North Carolina. And Granddad was a copywriter, and Mr. Thomas was more of an artist. And he would put together, if you will, the pre-press stuff. And then they would go out and get all that done and provide advertising for these various manufacturers. Well, just right after they got this little boutique agency going, the stock market crashed. And they kind of looked at each other and said, well, wait a second, we've put this money out, how are we going to get paid? And Granddad told me that they literally loaded up their cars with all these books and went out, and they did everything by barter. So they went to the printers, or they went to the furniture manufacturers, and they would gather up furniture, and they would take those to the printer or whoever they owed money to, the typesetters, anybody. And so they kind of bartered their way out of a deep hole. And then after that got done and they took care of their obligations, Jake and Granddad split for whatever reason, and Granddad ended up moving to Roanoke. Somehow he finagled a connection with some of the people that were in the advertising department at the Norfolk and Western Railroad, and he was invited to come up here and work on behalf of the railroad's account, and that really spawned Houck Advertising.
Because people don't see it these days, they don't understand what a big deal having the railroad was in the 30s, 40s, 50s. I mean, it's like having Procter and Gamble. It was an account any agency in the country would have killed for. Give us some context. What was it like? And I know that you were not born then, but still, historically, you're as good a keeper of the flame as anyone. What was it like having the railroad as a client at that time?
Well, it's always nice to have one account that pretty much is your bread and butter. It paid for just about everything. And in terms of that, I remember when I was a young kid, probably 5 or 6 years of age, in our building where is now the cancer center over by the hospital. They had an art department across the north side of the building that had probably 12 artists. Did everything, you know, in terms of original art. They liked illustration. They didn't do much photography back then, and if they did photography, they would farm it out to someone maybe in Washington or in New York. They were always running up and down the roads to bigger cities, Richmond and so forth. But having that one, if you will, anchor account allowed the agency to then, you know, spread its wings and go after other businesses. Of course, our roots were in the furniture industry, and so back and forth to High Point, down in the Winston-Salem, all through the Carolinas, that was pretty fertile territory. You know, Charlotte hadn't taken off yet. Greensboro really was still somewhat sleepy. Roanoke was a big deal back then because of the railroad. The railroad provided not only a lot of jobs, but high-paying jobs. And Roanoke was such a place that a lot of businesses came into the area to help, if you will, some of the maintenance work that was going on here. Just up the street here at Schaefer's Crossing, there was a lot of maintenance work being done. Fabrication of box cars, retooling of brake systems. Graham White created some really amazing braking systems, and they became a big deal, not only just for the Norfolk and Western, but a lot of the railroad companies all over the place. So it fed us and fed us very well as a family and a family-owned business and the people that worked for us. And Granddad and Dad were fortunate to keep that account, and I believe it was some 40 years. When I came to the agency in 1974, the account had been gone about 7 years at that point. And of course, with management changes, they decided to take the business to New York. Well, you know, it was a $1 billion corporation at that point. They could pick anybody they wanted to. So we were fortunate and blessed to have kept the business for a long time.
I think he was long gone, probably before you even became advertising aware. But what do you know about Otto Whitaker and the I Am the Nation ad that was, it's one of the great pieces of American prose. It has nothing to do with it being an ad, but it just happened to be an ad that was done at your family's shop.
Well, believe it or not, Otto actually came back and worked with us when I was in the agency business. He had left the market, gone off into bigger and better things, worked for Leo Burnett in Chicago. And I think he retired from there and he came back down. And then we were in the need of a copywriting type of person. We'd moved our offices when we sold our building over by the hospital, and we moved out on Brambleton Avenue in the old Fralin and Waldron building, which was right before you get out to Garce Mill Road. They had a small building out there, and we took that over. And Otto came to work, and he just wanted to work project work about half a day. But it was really cool to be around him because he would tell stories about back in the 40s when he was working for Granddad and working on the railroad account. And the railroad, of course, was pretty demanding, and when they needed something, it was like, let's get on with it, And I think that they envisioned what was going to happen with the 4th of July, and Otto was given the assignment to come up with a way to let people know about how the railroad really appreciated the fact that, we have this country in which we live. And I think he's told me that he was just driving home, and the idea just sort of germinated on his way home. And then he just sat down and started banging it out on an old typewriter, and one thing led to another, and he created this masterpiece that has, far exceeded his lifetime. And I can't tell you how many accolades that he received for that. And of course, being associated with us, we got the benefit of him having worked there when he wrote it.
Yeah. It was in Deer Abbey just this year.
It was?
Yeah.
Oh, man.
And one of the coolest things I found is there's a recording of Johnny Cash doing I Am the Nation. So I'm trying to get the rights to use that, and if I don't, I'll probably ask for forgiveness instead of permission. I mean, this is not a financial boon for anyone. Excuse me. During your time, what were some of the key accounts that you guys held in the 70s and 80s?
Well, our largest account when I came to work at the agency was American Motor Inns. It was not a heavily creatively oriented business, if you will, but they were the largest franchisee of Holiday Inns in the country at the time. They had over 50 Holiday Inns that stretched from Maine to Florida. They had a couple of offshore properties in Puerto Rico and St. Thomas. They had a large billboard, if you will, presence out there for obvious reasons. That's long before the internet sort of siphoned off the directional, if you will, advertising that a lot of hotel properties did back in those days. And so that was one account. We worked with Bassett Mirror, which was a mirror manufacturing facility just south of town. Magic City Motors, Magic City Ford, local business. CMT Sporting Goods, which I think has long since gone out of business, but at the time was the largest sporting goods retailer in the area. We did work for a company called Salem M. Eways, which was a Oriental rug retailer in Charlottesville, and another one up there called Purcell Oriental Rugs. We did work down in the coal fields, in some of the manufacturing facilities down there. We were all over the dial, because back then you really, with the exception of having these, a couple anchor accounts, you really had to reach out, a couple, 3 hours. I know before I came to work at the agency, they were spending a lot of time in Richmond and had connections with a lot of the government down in our capital. But when I got back, when I came into it, it was a period of transition. We were scratching around and going up against people like Associated Advertising and Systems 4 and Gross Close and Poindexter and some brand, Edmunds Packet. I mean, just the old school agencies that were very competitive at the time. And anytime we had a shot at something, we'd go for it. I think, though, before I got there, it was almost as if business landed in the agency's lap, because, they had a pedigree, they'd been around for a long time, good reputation in terms of account service, but we weren't really known so much for our creative work. And Brand Edmunds got on the scene, and it was all about the creative, and they took off like gangbusters, and they were winning all manner of awards. And then some of the people that worked there broke off and started their own deals, like that normally happens, in our business. And so in the 70s, there was a real gold rush to improve creative throughout the Valley's advertising community. And we were a little late getting back to it. And, we, as I said earlier, we were sort of retrenched and went back to somewhat of, if you will, the style of an Otto Whitaker, which was very copy-laden, as opposed to more a staccato, headline, subhead, more of a branding approach. Otto's work and people of that generation wanted to tell a story. They were always telling stories, and they would do it in a very interesting fashion. But as we got into a faster pace type of economy and people were moving quickly all over the place, it seemed to me as though what you really needed was a strong headline, a good subhead, maybe a jingle. We called them jingles back then. I don't think that people even talk about jingles now. But it was all about boom, 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 boom. And the turnover of good creative ideas was good. It helped, if you will, ignite interest in not only the creative community, but also in the eyes of the customers, and they were more demanding for better and better creative, and it just really made sense for that, if you will, evolution to take place.
You doing okay, Blair? Mm-hmm. All right. Tell me about the merger.
Oh, with Claude Harrison.
Yeah, was that before you, or it was after you, or what was the process there, and what did it bring together? What were the benefits?
Well, Claude's agency was, at the time we began talking, probably the hottest creative shop. He was doing a lot of good work, and Jerry Conrad was there, Jan Wilkins was there. Jan came out of WROV Radio. He had spent a lot of time out of the market and seen some really good stuff. I'm sorry I can't remember the guy's name. Kevin O'Neill. Kevin O'Neill had worked at WROV, and he won every blessed radio award imaginable. And he had gone through, I think, the Hollins creative program. They have a creative writing program. And I think to stipend his lifestyle while he was in school, he got hooked up with Bert Levine. And he was writing fantastic ads, and he won a tremendous number of if you will, gold addies at the time. And Conrad was going like, we got to get this guy. So they nabbed him, and he just kept on doing fantastic work. And so Claude Harrison and Company's portfolio just exploded. I mean, they were doing stuff for Colonial American Bank, and I remember they did this one spot, and it was a takeoff on Clint Eastwood, and it was about the time ATMs became, very popular, and they did an ad sort of, following the whole fistful of dollars genre of movies, those Italian spaghetti westerns, what have you. And they did a thing called, it was all about, you got the key, and they had this little ATM card, and they were trying to figure out how to break into the bank, so to speak, and it was very clever. And so I think O'Neill took off, went to Richmond, and did very well down there. And I just picked up the phone one day and called Claude and started talking to him because, I knew he was younger than my grandfather. And I was just curious about what he was going to do, when the time came for him to kind of hang it up. And he said, well, I'd really like to sit down with you. So we just sat down and started talking about the what ifs of putting the two shops together. And he wanted to sell his building, which was down, I think, Mountain Avenue and Jefferson Street. And of course, we'd moved off of Jefferson Street, and we were out where I said earlier on Bramilton. And we were able to piece together, if you will, an agreement. We paid him for his agency. He agreed to work with us for about a year through transition. He brought his folks, his really good folks over at the time, of course, Claude Harrison and Jan Wilkins. And it just fit in. It was like, peas and carrots. It just really worked out really well. They had the type of accounts that allowed for stronger and stronger creative. We were more of a almost business to business. They were more retail oriented. And then with the conglomeration of the two, we could go out to market, and we ended up recruiting guys like Chuck Rapetti and Jim Wilson, and it worked out really well.
Tell me about how you got Blue Cross Blue Shield of Ohio. That was not the kind of thing that you would think.
No.
A Roanoke agency would go after, and it wouldn't be the kind of thing you'd expect us to win. So how'd you do that?
Well, it really came together by virtue of the work that Claude Harrison had done initially for Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Southwest Virginia. And then when we put the two agencies together, we were able to expand upon that account that was domiciled here. At the time, there were two Blue Cross Blue Shield companies in the state of Virginia. One was in the central and eastern part of the state, and the other one was headquartered here. Anyway, we were able to put together a campaign that when the two Blue Cross and Blue Shields were given authority to practice in the other guy's territory, that allowed the Southwest Virginia plan to get a jump on them. The General Assembly said, "Well, we're going to let the barriers of competition down so y'all can cross over, but you can't start until July 1st." Let's say that was the date. Well, they didn't say you couldn't advertise in the other guy's area before that. So we went out and created a campaign that allowed a whole lot of interest to be generated in what the Southwest plan had to offer in other parts of the state. And when the switch was flipped to allow them to literally compete, the call center here in town just blew up. I mean, they couldn't take all the phone calls. Well, that got a lot of interest all through the various Blue Cross and Blue Shields in their network across the country. And there were similar, if you will, actions taking place in other areas. I think Ohio had 2 or 3, maybe 3 Blue Cross and Blue Shield plans. It was a much more densely populated state, and geographically they divided the state up. And so through those associations, we were introduced to the management of Blue Cross and Blue Shield out of Cleveland. And they were trying to get, if you will, some laws changed in the state of Ohio that would be beneficial to them doing business in a more competitive fashion. But they had a short time frame. I think they had 6 weeks in which to get it done. Well, Jerry Conrad, Jim Wilson, and Chuck Rapetti flew up there, sat down with them, they came back and they created about 8 commercials. I think 6 were actually produced. They put them on the air, just blitzed the market, and they got the law changed. And then after that success, they said, well, gosh, why don't you guys open a shop here in Cleveland and be our agency? So we decided that we would roll the dice and go up there, and we did. We worked up there for about 2 years. Mr. Conrad moved up there. Rapetti and Wilson stayed down here because they had families down here, but Jerry was, his kids were gone, so he went up there. And that was a blessing and a curse, because ultimately what happened was we lost that piece of business. And, Jerry came back down, and that was sort of the beginning of the, if you will, the slide of accounts out the back door. And before you know it, we decided to shut the agency down in 1989. After having a pretty good run for 60 some odd years.
That had to be hard. I mean, if you don't mind talking about it.
Not at all.
Just an amazing. Do you need water? I also have water.
No, I'm fine, thank you.
It had to be an amazingly hard decision for you to make. I mean, obviously, you've been really successful since then, but what was the process like?
To shut her down? Well, I can remember we were on Grandin Road, and we'd found a building down there similar to what you had. We had an old retail furniture showroom on the corner of Westover, I believe, and Grandin, and we'd rehabbed that. Anyway, we spent a lot of money to get it just the way we wanted to, and we'd grown the agency up. We were, in our creative peak, I guess you would say, and we had been able to acquire a lot of the business over time. But as I mentioned, the Blue Cross and Blue Shield thing was taking a lot of our time. It was a big piece of business, and the blessing and curse of having a predominant account is that they take a lot of time, sometimes to the detriment of your smaller accounts. You have to keep focus on the smaller ones because they're a lot easier to replace than a big account. Anyway, not only did Blue Cross Blue Shield go away, not in Ohio, but also in Virginia. Those two groups merged, so that account ended up in Richmond, I think at the Martin Agency. It was hard for us to compete against, the Martin Agency because they were it back then. And then we started losing other accounts very quickly. So Dad and I, we consulted with our accountants and our attorney, and we could see the handwriting on the wall. We had this fixed overhead that was pretty significant, not only in payroll, but in terms of, having to pay the rent on the building and so forth. We looked around at the attrition and how quick it was going out the back door with no hope of replacing it quickly enough. And Dad was probably 64, 65 at the time. And we said, well, we can dig deep, into our savings, and we can prop the agency up and basically shrink it down to, a very small elite group, if you will, and try and build it back up, or we can just shut her down. And we elected to shut her down. We weren't too keen on pulling equity out of our homes or invading our retirement plans, what have you. And so we very methodically began the process of closing it down. It took a while, of course. We tried to find everybody who worked for us gainful employment, making sure that we had an opportunity for them to interview with as many people as they could, either here in town or somewhere else. Just made sure they had good referrals and great references and so forth. We had to deal with all the media and all our suppliers, and it was a terrible time, I have to tell you. It was personally, it was probably as close to dealing with the death of a close relative as I've ever had to deal with. And it just kept on keeping on. We had accumulated so much advertising materials, and I can remember we had a dumpster the size of this studio out behind the office. And I can't tell you how many times I filled that thing up with stuff that we had brought over from the other shops. Old proofs, audio tapes, I wish I had them, videotapes, you name it. We had tons and tons of stuff. So it was a complete, if you will, burial. And when we finally, we had to keep a certain amount of stuff like payroll files and so forth because the government required it. But it probably took us 6 weeks to finally shut her down. And it was painful. And I left the advertising business for about 2 years. I was stinging bad, but I missed it. And so after about 24 months, I decided to get back into it. And that was nice. And I went to work for a guy, if you don't mind me talking about it. There was a fella here, you probably remember this young fella. His name was Brett Morey. Great designer, was just doing stellar work. Was one of the first people to really embrace the technology, Apple. And he was pretty much a studio type of art director. And he too was winning a lot of awards and recognition and so forth. So in my other life, after Houck Advertising closed, I went to work for a company called Business Management Services, and we sold payroll services and employee benefits and so forth. And Brett was one of my clients, and so I'd go by and see him, and I was just enthralled with what was going on with the desktop publishing, and so forth and so on. Well, after about 18 months, I decided I was a fish out of water, and so Brett and I sat down and we talked about me going to work for him and selling a little bit of his work. And so I left BMS and started working at Brett's shop, which was down on Franklin Road. And I was there 7 weeks, and I was getting a paycheck every 2 weeks. Well, after the 7th week, he looked me in the eye and said, "I've run out of money." And he had to close his place down. So I'm like, oh my gosh, what's happening? And in the interim, I had been doing some ad hoc account service work for a friend of mine. And I'd been introduced to Keith Austin, who was a general manager at Lamar Advertising. And I was gathering information for Jeff Lorge, who had a small media firm here in town, but he was in transition to move to Lexington, Kentucky. And he was in the process of putting together a buy for Subway. They had a co-op, an advertising co-op, and I had sat down with Keith Austin, who was helping me put together some rates and some data for Jeff's client's benefit. And I called Keith up and said, Brett's shop is closing, and I had been away for the weekend, and I'd seen an ad in the Richmond paper about a position with Lamar Advertising in Richmond. And I'm calling you to find out about that. He said, would that be a good move for me? I was convinced I might have to leave Roanoke. He said, well, I need somebody here. He said, I've added one person. I need another account executive. I'm even thinking about having someone be a sales manager, but we're not quite big enough yet. And I said, well, why don't we get together and chat? So we ended up going downtown to, there was a little coffee shop down there. I think it was called Mill Mountain Coffee. And we sat down there and talked for 3 hours about stuff. And I, about 2 weeks later, was working for Lamar. And I've been there for 22, almost 23 years.
You've traveled all over the country, both when you were here going after accounts, and certainly in your work with Lamar. How do you feel like the talent level at Roanoke stacks up across the country as a general rule?
Well, I would say that the work that has come out of Roanoke can stand up to anything, anywhere. You know, our agency was fortunate enough to win a lot of recognition all over the place. But some of these other agencies I talked about, Brand Edmonds, Packet, my goodness, Systems 4, Claude Harrison and Company, Associated Advertising, I mean, just on and on and on. Those guys received far more recognition, I think, in terms of national professional organizations. I know Edmonds Packet won one shows. I don't know if anybody else has won any one shows in this market. The AAF and their Gold Addies, a number of those have been won. Houck and Harrison, when we were handling the Blue Cross account, we won a Gold Effie, which is not really a creative award, but it's more of a marketing award for the work that we did on the campaign that I mentioned earlier. I live pretty close to LA, and I see a lot of good stuff. I'm real involved in the American Advertising Federation, and we actually run, in District 15, we run the LA Addies. And I could tell you that the work here can stand toe to toe with the work over there in terms of the idea. Now, you know, you've got production values you can buy if you've got the deepest pockets in the world that can take an idea and really blow it up so that it is very impressive. And I get that. But in terms of the essence of the idea, those ideas can happen any place and in every place. And today, with communications the way they are, you don't necessarily have to be in New York or Chicago or Atlanta or LA or Seattle. You can be anywhere. I'm sure you witness it, maybe y'all do too. You can buy someone's talent and you can get it, you know, from any market in terms of production values. But you can also use your local resources. So there's no, if you will, there's no cornering of the market on creativity by geography.
Just a couple more questions here.
Sure.
What do you like about advertising? What do you still like about advertising after all these years?
Well, I like the fact that I get to learn about things, cutting edge things, being able to continually educate myself and be excited about first to the market ideas. To me, that's exciting. I like the energy in the business, and I like the fact that there's always change going on, improvement, enhancement. Even old products can be displayed in such a way that people really look at them differently, and all of a sudden they might have a backslide where they were going, you know, losing market share. You create an idea that just captivates, if you will, the consumer, and boom, it turns it around. Reintroduction of Hostess Twinkies, a good example of that just recently. They've gone absolutely ballistic. The other thing that I like about our industry, I think that as an industry, the advertising field was one of the first, if not the first, to really have equality of pay for women and opportunities to grow quickly and through the ranks. You know, I look at the stuff, you know, Mad Men and, you know, if you will, the heydays in New York and so forth. And yeah, you know, I remember the thin lapels and the thin ties and, you know, all that stuff. I sort of grew up around it because I saw it in Houck Advertising back in the 50s and so forth. But what I really liked about it was the fact that in Roanoke, Virginia, there were some great female creative people that, if they weren't making enough money, they go out and start their own agency. All of a sudden, they're competing toe-to-toe with the men of the market. But I really like that aspect, that there's always been an opportunity, an upside for women in our business.
That's great. Any funny stories that you remember from your time advertising here?
Funny stories.
I can't tell most of them.
I know. I think